When BBC Local Radio began in 1967, Fleet Street dubbed it the switched-on Parish pump. Neil Walker and David Clayton now take a celebratory dip into the first 2 decades of BBC Local Radio.
This is BBC Radio Leicester.
To serve local people, to promote their interests, to promote their prosperity, to inform them what was going on in their neighbourhood, to be a forum for the discussion of their problems, in every way to help the local community and to make local life more interesting and to enrich the standard, the quality of life locally. That was what I wanted local radio to do, and I felt that there was a very great need in Britain for that kind of service.
Those were the ambitions of Frank Gillard when he was Director of Sound Broadcasting at the BBC 20 years ago, and when, unless you'd been to America, no one had even heard of a local radio station.
Well, despite Frank Gillard's optimism, there was resistance to the idea. Some thought local radio unnecessary and others that it was too revolutionary, and the whole thing nearly foundered.
The Post Office had resisted all the BBC's approaches and said there will be a committee of inquiry and that committee will make the decision, or make the recommendation. They gave us a rough ride. I came away feeling very depressed, wondered what I could do about it, got hold of a member of the Pilkington Committee who happened to live in my region, got him to come and spend a weekend with me, discovered to my horror from him that local radio had been totally crossed off the agenda. They were not even going to discuss it any further. I had a very wearying weekend arguing with my guest, and finally he said, I promise you nothing except one thing. At our next meeting, I will ask the committee to reinstate local radio on the agenda, and it could be argued further. And that was really the turning point, because in the end, we were able to make that committee do a complete U-turn and come out with a unanimous recommendation that there should be BBC local radio paid for out of the licence fee, and that was a great triumph for us.
Good afternoon from Radio Leicester, broadcasting on 95.05 VHF. Here is the Postmaster General, the Right Honourable Edward Short.
This is the first hometown radio station in Britain. It opens a new and, I think, exciting chapter in the story of British radio.
This is BBC Radio Stoke-on-Trent.
Radio Nottingham on VHF 94.8 and Rediffusion Channel C. Remember our slogan, tune in and listen, come in and take part.
And that's how the first 3 stations sounded back in November 1967, quite dated now. They were co-funded by the local authorities who chipped in something like £1,000 a week to run them.
And radios Leicester, Nottingham and Stoke were soon joined by Durham, Merseyside, Brighton, Leeds and Sheffield. And that antique sound borrowed from the networks was soon replaced as more and more new stations opened, developing a brighter and brasher image.
6:25 across the moors and the tors, the valleys and the islands. It's BBC Radio Cornwall on medium waves and VHF. Radio Jersey in the morning. Radio Northampton, Shropshire Radio.
No problems reported on the buses, trains or at the airports, so that's the WM Travel News.
Radio Cleveland.
Oh, by the way, the tide times. High water on the River Tees, 9:47 this morning. Low water, 3:37. 5 to 8. Time for Idiot Trivia. Kevin Kinghorn, how are you?
Hi. There we are, Kevin Kinghorn having a go at a bit of radio trivia. And that's what the critics often say about local radio, that it dabbles in the trivial and often features inconsequential waffle.
Yes, but let's face it, most conversation is about inconsequential things. People don't stand at the bus stop talking about the presidential elections in America. They talk about whether the bus is going to arrive on time or the price of eggs.
And, of course, things that affect them personally. That's the bread and butter of Dennis McCarthy's afternoon programme. Now, he broadcasts from BBC Nottingham to the East Midlands daily, and it's the listeners who dictate the content.
The BBC once said it entertained, informed and educated. Not necessarily in that order. When local radio came along, it added something else, and it's perhaps the most important thing as far as local radio is concerned, and that is it gives community service. Now, I think the BBC proper in London will never understand community service, but listeners to local radio throughout the country will understand it. It can come in small things. A home of old age pensioners rang up. Their washing machine had broken down. It was an old washing machine. Within an hour, a brand new washing machine had been plumbed in, and they were able to use it.
That's community service. Now, that couldn't happen on network radio. It could only happen on local radio, and that's what I'm into.
And Dennis is into it very successfully with a huge and devoted audience. And it's that willingness, it's the ability to fix things for people that gives local radio such appeal.
And the thing about live phone-ins is they're so much fun. Strange requests come over the airwaves, like this poor chap in Sheffield who was pinned underneath a wardrobe.
Next call, then.
I'm wondering if any of your listeners in this area could help me. I am stuck under a wardrobe on the staircase.
You're not.
Yes, the wardrobe has got 4 hooks on it, and the hooks have caught onto the banister, and I just can't move.
How can you get to the telephone?
Well, we've a long extension, and my wife handed it up to me.
I seen your wife. I'm sorry, Mr. Savage.
She can't help me.
Yeah, it sounds like a very funny situation, but it isn't. Is it hurting you at all?
No, it's not. Actually, if I move, I'm scared the whole wardrobe flies down the stairs.
Right, okay. Whereabouts do you live there, Mr. Savage?
And the good news is that within a few minutes some listeners had been round and come to his aid.
Well, local radio is littered with stories like that. There was the case that Radio Cumbria quotes of somebody who'd got a letter in Russian and they couldn't read any Russian. They put out an appeal on the air, and within a few hours they were inundated with people who could speak and write Russian. They wondered where all these people had come from.
And there was the Norfolk businessman who set off to Manchester for a very important business trip. 5 minutes after leaving his house, a phone call came to his wife to say don't bother to come. The only way she could get in touch with him and stop him wasting a lot of time was via the local radio station and appeal on air, knowing that he'd be listening.
Well, I think it's the feeling that each local radio station belongs to its community that makes it compulsive listening for so many people.
As soon as I get up, I put it on, and it's on nearly all day. I can do without the television.
Well, you get the local news and racing results and football results, you know.
I like to listen to phone-in when people's views on all different things that's going up. I like to listen to that.
You can send in for a dedication for birthdays, and they're good with the weather forecast.
I like the local news, the local travel that's going on, the local entertainment that goes on.
All about the traffic jams mostly, because I live near the Dartford Tunnel.
We went to Mallorca one year and fell in love with a record of Tony Bennett's. When we came home, my husband requested it on Radio Sheffield. I mean, my sisters, we're both twins. It was great. Kissed my husband for doing it.
Yes, but not everyone welcomes the intervention of local radio, especially when you're the last inhabitant in a row of terraced houses being demolished and someone wants you for the news bulletin.
Hello. How are you?
What is it?
Michael Cook. I'm from the Sheffield Radio.
It makes no difference. I can't do it. I want to be quiet. I've had enough on it.
What of?
Visiting. I don't want them. I don't want nobody. Why do you come tinkering and messing the people about? I haven't sent for you, have I?
No, I've only come to see you.
Well, that'll do then. Well, I don't want to see nobody, thank you.
Don't you think you would be better off if you moved house?
No.
Why not?
Because I'm here. Go on, get off, please. I'm right enough. Can you be told?
Yes.
Well, then, be told then, and have done with it.
The intrepid Michael Cook. Well, when local radio started 20 years ago, there was no blueprint for the kind of programmes that they should make. There was no auntie breathing down their necks, and the manager at Radio Sheffield, Michael Barton, later to become the controller of all of the BBC's 32 stations, remembers that moment of freedom.
Every station was able to choose what programmes it was going to put out locally, what kind of programmes, when they were to go out, and also what to broadcast from the networks. We were able to pick and choose and balance the whole range of output between local and national material. And of course we were able to react almost immediately to local requests for particular programmes, whether they were for the blind, the scouts, jazz buffs, ethnic minorities, or indeed any other special interest.
And in an effort to cater for some of those special interests, a few strange decisions were made by producers who thought they knew best what the local audience wanted, like on this occasion where they tried to encourage their audience to go to sleep.
Today we're going to do a short cut with relaxation to the art of sleeping. Warm and comfortable are you? Close your eyes. Feel a general tired weight all over as you sink into your bed or chair.
Yes, a great idea, unless you're driving in your car listening to that.
Well, if you thought that was a good sedative, what about Al Gillian's dedication programme on Radio Humberside?
Hello.
My name's Al Gillian, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our programme, which is for you alone. This is the programme in which our pianist, Jimmy Gibbons, plays your request at our studio piano, and I have the pleasure of reading your dedication.
Yes, what a very calming effect that has. Well, one thing the BBC's always been nervous about over the years is accents. Now, when local radio came along, you sounded out of place if you didn't have a local accent.
Yes, you see, your audience expects you to pronounce local towns and villages the way they pronounce them, not the way you've been taught on the BBC to pronounce them. I remember at Radio Humberside, when I worked there, pronouncing the town Withensea, Withensea, that's the way it's spelled. But in that area, they call it Witherensea. You've got to get it right.
And, of course, in Radio Norfolk's area, many a reporter has come a cropper with the word Haysborough, which is spelled Happisburgh. Radio Cumbria was quickly told by its audience to speak proper.
But it's not only place names that get all chewed up and spoken, to my way of thinking, wrongly. We talk about a school having classrooms, and you get people coming along announcing about class. Well, that's not for local radio. You get people talking about castles. We don't get on a bus, we get on a bus. And let's have that sort of announcement on local radio. And if it's local news, let's have local pronunciation.
Well, pronunciation was relatively easy to handle, but as the stations began generating their own news, they hit another problem. They had been taking the news from London, followed by the local bulletin, but often they felt that their own local stories were more important. At Radio Leeds, for instance, Phil Sidey and Alan Shaw met the problem head-on by mixing the two.
Leeds and the world at one. This is Alan Shaw reporting. When we set up our own news service, it was an interesting experiment. We were the only station to collect our own news. Other stations relied solely on outside freelance news agencies. We also did our own national and international news, and I remember we were the first outpost of the BBC to mention that war had actually broken out in Czechoslovakia.
There was a terrible rumpus about doing that, and indeed the BBC, I think it's an open secret, were not at all pleased at the idea of our endeavouring to cover the world as well as Leeds.
And there were other conflicts about the treatment of news as well. Every national story was in fact, of course, a local story for someone else, and we all remember the Cod War with Iceland back in the 70s. Radio Humberside, with its deep-sea fishing fleet centred on Hull, had its own way of reporting daily incidents to the local community. Jim Latham was their news editor.
You simply cannot go on the air at a time when ships were being lost in bad weather and for all sorts of reasons, and say, we've just heard such and such a vessel has overturned and sunk. Because as soon as you mention the name, everybody knows who's on board. And analyse your own feelings. Would you like to be sitting in your own lounge and be told your husband, brother, son was dead? That is not the way that news of that sort should be broken. So for instance, in our case, we had an arrangement with the Port Commissioner. And it was a fairly quick process, so the news wasn't delayed that long. But we allowed him to approach families, first of all, break the news. It was his job to do that. And he would tell us that the families had been told. At that stage, we'd go on the air with some detail.
As local radio grew, so the BBC came to rely on the stations more and more to gather news from the grassroots. Local radio had the contacts, after all. It had reporters on the spot, and it could move fast when major incidents occurred, such as the Nipro chemical plant explosion at Flixborough, which many people will remember. It was on South Humberside, and 55 people died in that explosion. 75 people were injured, and 20,000 had to leave their homes. Jim Latham again.
I was digging a very recalcitrant garden at the time when, on a Saturday afternoon at about 10 to 5, there was this enormous bang. Even though we were about 25 miles away from Flixborough, I thought my house windows had gone in. It's very difficult to describe, this huge echoing bang that sort of came from nowhere. Quite clear that something enormous had happened. Saturday afternoons at 10 to 5 are not the best time to pull together a news team in a local radio station. And it was a tribute to the lads who worked in that newsroom at that time that by 5:30 we had most people in place. Somebody on site, looking at it, shocked out of his brain, not quite capable of interpreting what he could see.
There are houses that are partially demolished. In fact, it does look as if a major
bomb disaster has taken place in this tiny South Humberside village. We have been warned by the police to move away from the Nipro plant because, in fact, they are expecting a second explosion. I can see police officers through the window of the house at this moment, searching carefully to ensure that there's no people still left in the houses. I'm in the hallway of a house here in Flixborough. There's glass all in the hallway. By this telephone, in fact, there is a blood-stained handkerchief. I've seen women walking down the streets, covered in blood, men looking afraid and worried, small dogs running all over the place. In fact, this is a major disaster.
And local radio has been at the forefront of many other major stories: the Bradford fire, the Brighton bombing, even the hurricanes of last autumn.
We don't actually know what local radio would have done in the Second World War. It wasn't around at the time, but we have seen how local radio can handle something like the Falklands conflict. Radio Solent, who of course had a great number of its community involved in the South Atlantic, was able to act as a kind of a safety valve to let off steam, a shoulder to cry on and that sort of thing during the war, especially when HMS Sheffield went down. But when it was all over, the local radio station was there. It was able to share in the emotional homecoming.
It's amazing. Everybody's looking up into the sky, and the balloons they're just going across the sun now and actually casting a shadow. There's so many balloons, and they're drifting away in front of the Canberra, up across the fleet of small boats and across the families of the Royal Marines who've been waiting here. And now they're beginning to sing Land of Hope and Glory. We've just had a rendering of singing from the troops on board. Now the people behind me are beginning to sing. It's a great occasion, and if someone ever said that Britain isn't worth coming back to, well, it certainly is worth coming back to.
Now, that report, of course, would have come via the ubiquitous radio car, another result of pioneering of local radio, because it was discovered quite early on that by sticking a large mast on top of an ordinary saloon car and bunging a transmitter into the dashboard, a reporter could go almost anywhere and report instantly into a programme.
A great idea, but the instant outside broadcast has its own problems, especially if the studio comes over to you too late for your commentary on such a thing as canoe hockey, as sports reporter Mick Wormold recalls.
By the time they came over, there wasn't a ripple on the water because they'd packed up and paddled to shore. But still, we had to go ahead, so I did a kind of a replayed commentary on what I'd seen 200 yards away, as though it was happening, with considerable excitement in my voice. And I remember a lot of people standing around the radio car because they were interested in it, and looking at me, and then looking out at the water, and not even seeing a coot or a moorhen, and they must have thought I was an absolute lunatic.
And it's live situations like that which make local radio reporters extra resourceful and inventive. And it's not really only on live reports. Sometimes when you're in the studio with a bit of tape putting together a news story, you can be even more inventive, like Joe Bunting from Radio Cambridgeshire.
School dinners are unhealthy, I read in a report. They're far too full of fat and stodge, nutritional value naught. I wondered what the students felt about the food they get.
Not bad. Depressing. They're horrible.
They said. So what's the worst in their canteen that if they could, they'd ban?
The beans, the dirty equipment, the knife and forks. You should see it, man.
And that's not all the students hate about the things they're fed. There's also
the lumpy custard.
And even
stale bread.
What else is wrong with canteen food and the way that the cooks cater?
The beef burgers is rubbery and the bread's just like paper. The pizza's nasty custard. Hamburger. Pork.
It's not much fun when the clock chimes 1 and they pick up their knife and fork. So let's hear from the students now on what they'd like to dine.
Chicken, chips.
A turkey when it's Christmas time.
Spinach lasagna.
Very clever indeed. Can you imagine the 6 o'clock news being delivered that way? Though I suppose it's possible if that reporter happened to be Kate Adie or Michael Burke. Both of those began their careers as fledgling journalists on local radio, working first for Radio Durham and for Radio Bristol.
I remember that however hard-pressed we were, there'd be a knock on the newsroom door in the middle of the morning, and we'd have to go down and be the third spearman in the Easter Passion play that was being done by the by the religious producer. Or even more bizarre things, we'd have to go and actually clap the paper cups to sound like horses for the education department and all this sort of thing. And no matter what earth-shattering breaking news story was happening in Bristol at that time, we always had to sort of put our hands to the wheel there.
Look, if you drive a radio car around a housing estate somewhere in Newton Aycliffe and you're trying to interview members of the public at random and they all rush indoors and bolt their doors because they think you're the television detective van and they won't come out and speak to you. I mean, it prepares you for anything in broadcasting.
If you ended up doing a half-hour documentary in local radio, there was nobody to help you and went out and did everything yourself. But I will always feel very grateful for the year I spent in local radio, for its training and for the experience, and for probably the happiest working year of my life, really.
No, I never have missed it. It was unique, and we were lucky. We were coming in when stations were beginning, and that was the most exciting thing. It was wonderful. I loved it. What was nice was the comeback. I mean, none of us had ever been on air before. And when you did actually meet someone who sort of said, oh, I heard that and I liked it, it was thrilling. You were also very near your audience. Now, so much broadcasting, you're at a distance.
The only equivalent experience I've had of the audience being terribly involved in what we were saying is the South African government. Of course. We also came beating on the door in the end.
Probably slightly less frightening than Durham County Council in a full rage on some days when they actually arrived on your doorstep and started complaining violently, or they came along to interrupt the programmes and say, they had more information. It was fabulous. You don't get that anywhere else, really.
Well, it's not only the journalists who've worked their way to the top thanks to local radio. Airtime has been given to many a budding pop group, a comedian, entertainer and even poet.
I had a friend on Radio Oxford who at that time had a poetry programme, and he asked me if I could do one of my poems on Radio Oxford. So tremulously I came in 1974 and recited The Battery Hen here in Radio Oxford. And Andy Wright and Mike Dickin, who were the presenters, they fell about laughing in the studio, and Mike Dickin had to get up and go out because he was laughing so much. So that was an encouraging start. Margaret Howard of Pick of the Week picked it up for Radio 4. And then, amazingly, it was picked up, and to this day I still don't know how, by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and they broadcast it coast to coast in Canada, this humble poem of mine. And so, of course, Radio Oxford were very pleased that it had done so well, and they asked me to do some more for them, which I did.
And look what happened to Pam Ayres. She did all right.
Yes, but one of the reasons why people like Pam Ayres get discovered is that local radio producers are constantly scratching around for new people, new ideas to fill the airtime with. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But one early experiment, which has now been adopted by network radio and is the new toy of daytime television, is the phone-in. Tom Beasley well remembers the pioneering days of phone-ins at Radio Nottingham.
BBC Local Radio introduced the whole concept of access broadcasting, of the availability of decision makers in the local community to the people who were paying for their services. So we had phone-in programmes direct to the local leader of the council, to the chief constable, to the captains of industry, to the NHS administrators, to the DHSS administrators, and this still, of course, carries on. It was the first time people had had the opportunity to actually put their questions directly to the people who were making the decisions. And I think that was a major first that BBC Local Radio introduced.
You said you were going to sell them at a fair price? You no need to take no disagreement because his head's in the clouds like yours are.
Here. No, we never said we were going to sell it. We never said we were going to sell them at a fair price. We said we'd sell them at the market price, which was dictated to us by the national government.
Wait a minute. A sitting tenant price is not...
You wait a minute. I'm answering what you've just asked me.
All right, just let's sort this one out. Carry on, Mr. Guest, for another minute.
Well, I'll carry on for half a second arm off because it's to have to talk to. Good night and thank you.
Mr. Guest, before you... I see.
The first question is on the phone. It's Mr. Roy Chester.
Good morning. Who's speaking? Chester. Oh, good morning, sir.
Hello, Mr. Chester. Would you like to put...
I don't think we're on yet. No, I don't think we are.
Yes, you are on. Oh, yes, you are.
This morning.
So, Mr. Chester...
Isn't it beautiful out here just now?
Mr. Chester... Mr. Chester, would you like to put your question, please?
Well, it's crystal clear.
Mr. Chester, are you there?
I'm sunning myself.
There was the time when I asked a gentleman who was nicknamed the Duke. And he said, I don't know, gives a clue, Billy. And I said, the hell I will. And he said, well, you give everybody else one. And then, of course, there was the time when we asked the lady what was Adolf Hitler's first name, and she came back with the glorious reply, Heil.
Billy Butler of Radio Merseyside there, another local radio personality now seen regularly on the telly.
Well, you can take part easily in local radio phone-ins, but another nice thing about local radio is you can get a good old nose round the place when they have an open day. Now, for those of you still awaiting a BBC local radio station in your area, this recitation from the then Radio Blackburn, now it's called Radio Lancashire, on their open day, sums up the sort of friendly informality you can expect.
Mr. and Mrs. Ramsbottom and Albert were listening to Wireless one night, and an extra special announcement quite filled the young lad with delight. "Hey, ma'am," says young Albert, "it's Radio Blackburn. They say we can go round and see. Hey, happen we'll meet Jimmy Young." "Well," says father, "in that case you'll go without me. More likely the late-duty chemists or folk ringing up getting cross about bus stops or trying to swap an armchair for the budgie and 3 pints of gloss." Well, when all came to all, the Ramsbottoms took a trip up to King Street for day. It were Jubilee Open Day Monday, and it said there were nothing to pay. They went in to watch the broadcasting, and young Albert, who'd happened some sense, said before we sit down for 3 hours, I'd better just go to the gents. And of course, on his way back, he had to get lost, till he saw a red light on a door, and inside were a chap sitting all on his own, so Albert went in to explore. "Excuse me," said Albert Ramsbottom, who were getting a trifle confused. "Excuse me," but chap he were talking to glared and just carried on reading the news. The three-party leaders agreed that inflation was something we must overcome. The Prime Minister, speaking from Chequers, announced, "Excuse me, have you seen me mum?" Mr. Steele, on behalf of the Liberals, said it was always my steadfast intent to follow each avenue of progress. However, I got lost on my way back from gents. Mrs. Thatcher advised every shopper when comparing the goods on the shelf to always ask one simple question: "Why are you talking to yourself?" And he quite ignored Albert Ramsbottom and carried on reading the news, so Albert looked all round the studio for something to keep him amused. He came to a girt wall of switches labelled Radio 1, 2, 3, 4, and a lot more with letters and squiggles which he studied in wonder and awe. He switched them on one after t'other, and the people all listening at home got the football results in Swahili and the fish market prices from Rome. Closely followed by Radio Moscow and a station announcement from Crewe, which sounded as though Mr. Brezhnev was driving the 352. And then it went on, add the onions and fry in a cast-iron pan. At the third stroke it will be 9:10:66, and the Battle of Hastings began, with the Orpheus Choir singing Handel's Messiah, conducted by Sir Arthur Bliss, and England 2:20 for 6. "Cynthia, darling, we can't go on meeting like this." Just then the producer came running and pulled down a thumping gut switch, and after he'd put on some music, he said it was technical hitch. So if ever you're listening to wireless to a station I'd better not name, if it sounds like a load of old rubbish, it may not be us what's to blame.
Well, local radio has come a long way in 20 years, and in spite of the early, rather sniffy attitude towards this precocious service, the BBC says it's fully committed to it, though after 20 years it has yet to complete its chain of English stations.
So, how does the man who started it all regard local radio now? Here's Frank Gillard again.
I'm very proud indeed of it, and I think it's made a very great impact on the lives of an enormous number of people. And I know people who practically live by local radio. Now they know hour by hour, day by day, what's happening around them, what it all means and what it implies for the future. And if that isn't a big achievement, I don't know what is. I'm very, very pleased about it all. The one thing that I am worried about is that the range of the stations is becoming too great, and I hope that in the future it'll be possible for a local radio station to serve a single community instead of a plurality of communities. It's not the fault of local radio that it has to operate that way today, but one day, perhaps, we'll have 150 local radio stations in Britain. I hope so. Britain deserves them. Britain needs them. Let's have them.
The Switched On Parish Pump was presented by Neil Walker and David Clayton and produced by Ivan Howlett for BBC North East.